All right, well, according to my clock, it is 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'll give you one more reminder to please mute your phone so we don't get the background noise on the conference bridge mute. If your phone doesn't have a mute, you can do *6, unmute is #6. But most phones just have a mute. You can just hit the mute button, and that way you can control it much more easily. And if you have any questions, you can interrupt. But I do want to welcome you to our latest in our webinar Wednesday series. This one is focused on PSAP funding and the impact of the recalculation. Without trying to steal Dorothy's thunder, because we'll be presented by Dorothy Spears-Dean, we do have a requirement in code to recalculate how the funding is distributed, and the 911 board has been talking about what we're exactly going to do about that. They do have a legislative package that they're going to move forward with this year that's going to impact that. And we wanted to do this webinar to make sure everybody understands what the impacts are for sure, what the potentials are, and then what also the fallback plans are. Because at the end of the day, this is not something that we can totally control ourselves. This is something that's decided by the General Assembly and the Code of Virginia, and we have to comply with that. So, Dorothy's going to run through where we are, what the impact may be on each of you as PSAPs in the Commonwealth, and the level of funding that you receive, and then again what the plans are that we have moving forward. So again, please remember to mute your phone. If you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt as we go through. These sessions are for you. They're for you to understand what's going on and be able to ask any questions that you have. So please do not hesitate to ask. If you have the question, no doubt there's others listening in that have it as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Dorothy, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Well, as Steve mentioned, there is a current legislative requirement. So before we start talking about the what-ifs and the impact, I wanted to begin the webinar by first talking about what the current legislative requirement is. So on or before July 1st, 2017, and every 5 years thereafter, the Department of Taxation shall recalculate the distribution percentage for each PSAP based on the cost and call load data of the PSAP for the previous 5 fiscal years. So moving on to what this means to the local government and in particular the PSAP community. The recalculation or the outcome of the recalculation primarily impacts local governments. ISP staff can conduct whatever analysis is desired by local governments and PSAPs, but ultimately how this recalculation is applied needs to be determined by this community, because the end result of the recalculation process will be winners and losers. And we will talk about the impact of the recalculation next, but even if no funding changes are made, some PSAPs will receive more funding and others will receive less. And since we need to address funding in conjunction with the deployment of NG911, Next Generation 911, and the subsequent sustainment of 911 once this deployment occurs, we should address funding holistically to avoid any unintended consequences. We do want to, as I said, address or avoid addressing funding piecemeal. This can be extremely painful to try to do it in a piecemeal process, and there's also the potential for unintended outcomes or consequences. In the meantime, the reason that, and we'll be talking about some recent legislative activity to delay the recalculation for a year, was for the PSAPs to continue to have a stable funding environment and make, and we have the necessary time to make informed decisions. So moving on to the legislative agenda. The legislative agenda that was approved by the 911 Services Board at their September meeting was to delay the recalculation of the PSAP wireless funding distribution percentages until July 1st, 2018. And prior to the September board meeting, this legislative agenda was reviewed with the board's finance committee during their August 2nd meeting with the Regional Advisory Council. And as hopefully you are aware, the Regional Advisory Council has a PSAP representative that serves on the council. There's also an alternate for each of the 7 ISP regions. ISP staff, the Finance Committee, and the Regional Advisory Council, or as we call them, the RAC, recommended this legislative agenda for approval, and then the board took this action at their September meeting. I'm going to go on and talk about the impact of this legislative agenda, but before I do, I just wanted to pause for a moment and ask the group if you had any questions and or comments.
Hey, Dorothy, this is Steve Marzoff. Just real quick, I want to make it clear to everyone that what we're talking about here is the 60% of the funds that comes to the PSAPs automatically every month. We, back in 2012, I think it was, the board, right after we did that big reconciliation of the true-up, calculated based on the current law, which says it'll be distributed based on a pro rata share of what the localities received the prior 5 years, gave the Department of Taxation a percentage to do distribution to every PSAP, and that has been the same. That percentage has not changed since that time, since fiscal 2013. The idea was that there'd be changes in call load and changes in cost, so we needed to do a rebaselining, and that's why the code had this requirement to do a recalculation in 2017. So it's really just taking the same amount of money. It's not debating how much money to distribute. It's still 60% of the funds, so the size of the pie does not change at all. The only thing that changes is how we distribute that among the localities or among the PSAPs that are eligible for funding. So if one PSAP has grown faster than another PSAP, then they'll get more money, and another PSAP who's grown more slowly will get less money. But it's all about this formula that the Department of Taxation uses, and though the code that Dorothy read says the Department of Taxation shall calculate, it was determined between the Attorney General's counsels for both Department of Taxation and for the board, that the board sets it, tax implements it. So it's really a question of, okay, how do we distribute this money and what's that formula look like? But we've been on the same formula for 5 years, and now's when we're supposed to, according to the code, change it.
And Steve, thank you for that background information. Does anybody have any questions regarding the background information Steve just provided? Okay. Well, then I'm going to move on to slide number 5 and talk about the legislative agenda, the 2017 legislative agenda. And this is the legislative agenda that will go to the General Assembly when they convene in January of 2017. So the recalculation was delayed to enable the board to finalize a long-term 911 funding analysis. As I said, we didn't want to address funding piecemeal. We wanted to do it holistically. We wanted to make sure that when we do address the long-term solution for 911, we include the transitional costs for next generation 911. We address the sustainment of 911 because these components of the 911 funding analysis will be critical for when we move into the 2018 General Assembly session, where we'll be focusing on funding for the deployment and sustainment of a next generation 911 system. The 911 funding analysis that I just described has been discussed in detail as part of the Commonwealth's 5-year Next Generation 911 deployment plan. This discussion has taken place at the September board meeting and other venues. We've also talked about it on a prior ISP webinar. Currently, I'm working with several of the RAC work groups on the 911 funding analysis. The analysis will be completed in early December, and the document will capture the results of this analysis, and it will be publicly available mid-December, well in advance of the January 2017 board meeting, when I plan to review the document with the board and will be asking the board to accept and approve the analysis. This will give staff permission to begin socializing the analysis in preparation for the additional legislation that we are anticipating for the 2018 General Assembly session. So that directly relates to that last bullet you see on focus on funding for the deployment and sustainment of Next Generation 911. We want to develop transitional and long-term cost estimates for Next Generation 911 first, and then focus on a new funding solution. And again, that will be the focus of the 2018 proposed legislation. And as I said, we want to avoid addressing funding piecemeal. So moving on to the next slide. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about the impact of the recalculation. There is a spreadsheet on the ISP website. The link is provided here. And I would encourage everyone on this webinar to go to the website, take a look at the forecasted, it's not forecasted anymore since we have all of the 5 required years for the recalculation. Take a look at the impact for your locality. So again, the link here is provided, and I would encourage everybody to take a look at that. As Steve had mentioned earlier, the current wireless distribution percentages that are in place right now for the 60% of the fund are based on results of the true-ups that have been collected during fiscal year 7 and 12. So the recalculation that we're talking about right now is using data from fiscal years 2012 through 2016. So now that we have all of the data collected, the impact of the recalculation on PSAP is no longer a forecast. It's a known entity. So if we move forward with the recalculation without any changes, there will be some positive results, but there will also be some negative results. And some of the negative results will be the item that you see here, the second bullet on this slide, that PSAPs are now receiving at least $40,000 annually, but this floor will go away with the recalculation. In addition, 44 PSAPs will lose funding, and these amounts range from 5% to 72%, and 27 PSAPs will have their funding drop to below $40,000. This represents a reduction of between 15% and 72%, and some PSAPs, as a result of the recalculation, will receive just slightly over $13,000. Now, the PSAPs that will drop below $40,000 represent primarily the small and relatively rural localities, but there will be exceptions to the negative impacts that I just mentioned. Some negative shifts will be the result of no longer being able to include IT and GIS support in personnel costs. For example, Fairfax will be losing 31% in funding with the recalculation because they had in the past years, 7 through 12, included a large amount of IT and GIS funding in the true-up, which was allowable at that point in time. But with fiscal years 12 through 16, that is no longer the case. And as Steve has said earlier, the funding methodology favors the fastest growing localities. I'm going to switch now to talk about the legislative outcome since we've now reviewed the impact of the recalculation. But before I do, I wanted to stop once again and ask the webinar participants if anyone had any questions.
Hey, Dorothy, it's Steve again. To be perfectly clear for everybody, I want to make sure that, because this is important, that spreadsheet that Dorothy has given you a link to and encourage you to look at, that is if we were to take the current board policy and implemented it with the data that we collected from 2012 to 16. The Code of Virginia does not require us to do that exactly. The Code of Virginia says that it has to be based on call load and cost. That is what the board's policy, if we take what the board's policy was in 2012, the last time they set a formula, this is what it would result in. So, when Dorothy says it's known now, it's known based on if we were to implement the old board policy on today's numbers. So please don't take those numbers and say, oh my God, we're going to lose $30,000. That's an estimated based on the current board policy. So it's the way it would be if we were to, as Dorothy said, to change nothing.
Hey, Steve.
Board policy, the existing code and everything is. Go ahead.
Question for you, and I heard you say that this is the policy of the board and not state code, whereas state code just dictates this is set by the number of calls and all that good stuff. Is the $40,000 minimum, is that board policy? Where does that lie?
Okay, so this is where it gets a little complicated, but the way the 40,000 is, the way we have to ultimately, the way we once did it when the board was doing the distributions, we had the ability to ensure that nobody got less than $40,000 cash. And the way we did that was with some accounting gymnastics of saying, okay, 1/12 of 40,000 is whatever, and I can't do that math in my head that quick, but say it's a little less than 4,000, like 3,800 or something like that. If a locality got more than 3,800 in any particular month, Lewis automatically increased them to 3,800. Well, that money has to come from somewhere. So then we have to distribute that extra funding that they received among all the other localities who received more than 40,000 a year. So, the larger localities all received a little less because that small locality received a bit more. With the way the money is distributed now through the Department of Taxation, and we're required by code to do that, they can only do a percentage. So we could, underline the word could, establish a percentage minimum that we, based on the estimated revenue for next year, would result in nobody getting less than 40,000. But the way we do that 40,000 now is when we're doing that, the way we include that into this calculation is when we're looking at what we do is figure out basically a theoretical of what localities would get, and then add that all up, and based on, so what we take is their personnel percentage or personnel cost multiplied by the wireless percentage. If that amount is less than 40,000, we automatically increase them to 40,000. And then we compare that against all the other PSAPs and figure out what percentage that is. So we have some localities, if you take their wireless percentage of their personnel cost, would only get 10,000, but we increase that to 40. But it's not a real 40,000 because then that's just used to figure out their percentage. And what's happened over this last few years is the large localities have grown so fast and the small localities haven't, that, again, the money has to come from somewhere, even though that starting 40,000 in the calculation hasn't changed. The numbers for the larger localities have, and it's very difficult to explain over the phone. I'd be happy to sit down and go through that spreadsheet of how we exactly, but the end result is what you see in the spreadsheet there. So we take 40,000 into account in the calculation, policy in the past, but we have no ability to guarantee 40,000 without some sort of change in the way we've done it in the past.
No, I completely understand that, and it's a zero-sum game at the end of the day.
Yeah, again, the money has to come from somewhere. So if you start to take the money from if you start to give more money to, well, take your look at it, Orange, then that money comes, every dollar that goes to you comes from somebody else. So won't be the first time we've talked about this. It'll probably be about the sixth time in the 16 years I've been with the state that we've talked about it. And every time it gets to be very contentious, because at the end of the day, we want to be A, fair, B, reflect reality. Some would argue the reason the small locales will get so much less is because, well, they're not growing, so therefore the money should shift to the largest localities. But then that creates an economic burden, and the question is, do they even have the ability to close that gap, if that's the case? We have had some board members speculate, well, maybe that will drive some localities towards a consolidation. And is that a bad thing? And do we want to artificially sustain PSAPs that maybe shouldn't on their pure economics? And again, these are all policy questions that are going to need to be answered as we move forward with this.
And where does this go next? Does it go to the board next, or does it go to the policy committee next? What's the flow?
Well, this particular issue, Dorothy's getting into right now the legislative side of it, where we go from here. And, the board has adopted a position to delay this recalculation for a year.
Correct.
And then, where it goes from here is the question that the board's going to have to answer at their January meeting. But Dorothy, do you want to go ahead with that?
With the legislative outcome, or jump to the next step?
Go ahead to the outcome. Go ahead.
Okay. And we've covered some of this. So if the legislation doesn't pass, and we have no reason to think that it won't, we would proceed with the recalculation. Tax would receive the new funding distribution percentages, and the impact of the recalculation would occur with the fiscal year 18 monthly wireless PSAP payments. Another option is to have an alternate strategy within existing code. This would be a very short window in early 2017 to propose an alternate strategy, but it certainly would be an option if the legislation didn't pass. Being optimistic, let's look at what options we have if we are successful with the legislation in the General Assembly. The one option is we can still decide to change nothing and accept the impact. The result will be that the recalculation has been delayed for a year. The reason that we delayed the recalculation was to give time to complete the 911 funding analysis and also to address any necessary funding changes at one time. However, at the end of reviewing the funding analysis, the determination may be that no changes are needed with the current funding methodology. So again, let me reiterate, and I know Steve has already done this, this is a local government decision. ISP staff can provide whatever analysis is desired, but I guess to quote Steve, we don't have a dog in this fight. An alternative would be to, if change is desired, to focus on how the calculation is done. So you could use different cost and call load data elements. You could target specific outcomes by reverse engineering, or perhaps at the end of the review of the funding analysis, and we look at sustainment, the need for a new funding strategy becomes apparent. Perhaps this will be where we end up, So a new funding strategy would be necessary. But at the end of the day, the recalculation is not about increasing funding to PSAP, but rather redistributing the existing funding. So the results of whatever path we choose to go down will result in winners and losers. But the reason we delay the recalculation is to be able to make an informed and factual decision. So moving on to next steps, and this is actually the final slide. I wanted to make sure that I provided ample time for questions. Somebody is going to have to look at how we evaluate the PSAP funding formula recalculation. And I looked at what we've done in the past. We've established a 911 Services Board Committee to deal with the funding methodology issues. But that doesn't mean we have to go down that path. But we do need to take action at the January 12th board meeting. One thing that I'll be moving forward with this week, when I send out the announcement for the Regional Advisory Council call scheduled for December the 6th, I'll be adding an agenda item to discuss who should be leading this funding evaluation process. And I'm going to ask the RAC how they feel about leading this effort, because whomever is in place, it's still a local government decision, and we need to have the path forward identified and approved by January. Because in order to pull everything together to prepare for the 2018 General Assembly session, we need to have whatever recommendations that we want to move forward with ready for the board meeting in June of 2017. So I'm anticipating that the legislation to delay the recalculation passes, and that we will need to have a committee in place to deal with this and to bring the recommendations to the board at their June 2017 meeting. And that was everything that I had as far as material that I wanted to cover for the webinar. As I said, I wanted to make sure that we had ample time for questions. This is an extremely important topic for the PSAP community, and I wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to think about this and to ask questions. And you know, if you, in looking at the spreadsheet on the website, you have follow-up questions. This webinar is not your only opportunity to ask questions, but we wanted to make sure that we provided this information in a timely format to our local government constituents so they were informed and they knew what would be expected moving forward.
And this is Steve Willoughby, City of Richmond. I'm trying to grasp the logic of why we're going back to the legislature twice, once to delay and then a second time with the new Next Gen plan. Why would we not just do this once next year?
Well, whenever you talk about funding, you open yourself up to unintended consequences. So in order to deal with funding once in a holistic manner, to deal with it at one time, it made sense to delay the recalculation and to plan to address everything with the 2018 General Assembly session. And there was a long vetting process. We started off with informing the RAC. We had a Finance Committee meeting. ISP staff provided recommendations, and it was ultimately the board's decision at the September meeting to move down this path for the reason I just identified, to address funding at one time, also to make sure that we had the analysis completed from our 911 study.
Well, and Dorothy, this is Steve Marzoff. Steve, to answer your question, quite frankly, when we did that spreadsheet that's out there, if you haven't looked at it, please do, because again, we don't have a dog in this fight, as Dorothy said. However, we do listen to you, and we do care what happens to every PSAP in the Commonwealth. And some of the funding impacts of that funding formula change are devastating. So if we didn't go this year and we waited till next year to go and just go in 2018, we have to implement some sort of a change. We have to. We have no choice. The law requires a change right now, July 1st, 2017. And we think that that formula that is currently what we believe the board policy is, and the board has not told us we're wrong, an implementation of the current board policy would be devastating to a lot of PSAPs in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we don't think that's right. Now, we could, working within the existing code, come up with a new board policy, a different formula working within the code, and the code says must be based on call load and cost data, so the new formula. So we could come up with a different formula that is based on call load and cost, but quite simply and quite frankly, we've never been able to, when these issues come up the 5 or 6 other times, have never been able to reach agreement. Usually we don't have agreement, period. There usually ends up being 2 factions. One says this, one says this. There's a lot of contention, and then ultimately the board would pick one or the other and end up usually just tweaking the existing formula rather than radically changing it. But we've had a lot of suggestions through the years about just using call load and forgetting cost data. But they all have tremendous impact and that sort of thing. So the reason we're going twice is to not go now means we have to change the formula in July, and we just think that's wrong at this point. And as Dorothy said, we went through the process of discussing that with the RAC and the policy committee and the board, and they agreed. And I will tell you, as an update, we have found 2 patrons to carry the bill, Senator Eben and Delegate Anderson, who are supposed to be submitting it before the end of the week on behalf of the board or for the board. And we've also talked to VML and VACO. Now, VACO is aware of what's going on. They haven't provided feedback, but VML has supported the change because they don't want to see 2 changes back to back. Our intention is to go in 2018 with something more holistic that looks at Next Gen 911 as a whole and everything else. It may or may not change the 60% side of this equation. We don't know yet. But they would rather wait and keep the formula where it is and keep the percentages where they are for 1 more year than to change twice, is what their VML's input was. They would rather have a delay than 2 changes, one in 17, or as a result of the 17 General Assembly session, and then another one in 18. So they would much rather delay it. So that's why we're delaying. And, what the 18 exactly is going to look like, we don't know. It is starting to come together through the discussions with the RAC. And if you're, haven't been participating with the RAC calls, please do. The next one's December 6th. And as Dorothy said, we'll be asking the RAC for their advice on how or who should be this advisory committee to the board or this funding committee for the board to talk about this PSAP funding formula. It could be the RAC, but, in the past we've had VML and VACO representatives in the room talking with us about this formula. So we want to make sure we have the right people in the room to discuss what this formula should be in the future, or how we should look at this funding, because we definitely don't want to just get rid of the funding. You all rely on this 60% funding that comes from the Wireless 911 Fund. We don't think we can just do away with it. Of course, that could be an option, but we want to make sure we have the right people in the room to talk about it and figure out what is the best way to distribute this funding, recognizing there are changes in growth. And some grow faster than others, but also recognizing that 911 needs to be funded. And how do we accomplish that? Are there other questions?
Can you hear me, Jeff?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
A question, and I'm sure there's only a handful of PSAPs that have the consolidation that we had after here. But am I correct in understanding that if the legislation passes, then current funding we get, including from a PSAP we consolidated with, that would stay same for next year? Is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah.
So
right,
I think you're probably you're referring to Chincoteague. Chincoteague would still continue to receive their money the way they do now, and because the code said the way it's written is whoever was receiving it as of that date in 2016, I think it was, will continue until such time as the recalculation. Yes.
All right. So then on the flip side, if the legislation doesn't pass and there's no action, then the best guidance we can use as of today would be the spreadsheet for what we would be receiving, including Chincoteague. Is that right?
That's correct. And that's a good point. It does have an impact on consolidated PSAPs in that even though that minimum calculation stuff, the 40,000 in the formula, doesn't result in actually 40,000 to the locality, it does result in more money than they would have otherwise got. So currently, I'll take you as an example since you brought it up. Pre-recalculation, if you add up what Eastern Shore and Chincoteague get, it will probably, don't quote me on this because I have to look at your exact situation, but it will probably result in more funding than once you're consolidated. Because the amount of calls that Chincoteague may add to you may not be enough to really increase your percentage of funding that much. We've seen this in a couple other localities where when they consolidated before recalculation, they get the old locality still gets the funding based on what they had before. But when you merge the calls together and the cost together, it doesn't result in that great. It results in some increase, but it's not as much as the two added together. The sum of the parts is less than the two separate. And it's just the way the math works out. And again, I can sit down and show you how that works and why that works out that way on the spreadsheet itself, but it's just the reality. And, as long as we don't do a recalc, then those people who were prior consolidated still get the money, and through mutual agreement, they can, transfer the money to the consolidated PSAP. But once they're consolidated, then we treat them as a consolidated PSAP, and we're using the consolidated PSAP's call loads and costs, not the old data from the locality before. It's like Chincoteague disappears and never existed.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, this is Nikki. I have two questions. Is it possible to get a copy of what's being sent to Senator Evans and the delegate? Is it possible to see that, and just for informational purposes only?
Oh, absolutely, and I can jump to the punchline for you. All it is section 5644.17, which is 56-484.17, section C. The number 2017 is changed to 2018. That is the only change that is made. No other, nothing, not even a comma. It's 2017 to 2018. That's the only change.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you. And then the second question, and maybe this is something for the RAC or whoever handles this next too, but has anybody ever sat back and actually calculated how, so it sounds like 911 call volume and costs are outpacing the 911 tax or utilities tax or cell phone tax, wherever we're calling it. Has there ever been any type of cost comparison between what we're charging tax-wise versus what it's costing?
No, and I will tell you the reason that's never happened is we have the multiple funding sources. It used to be worse because we had the wire line surcharge, we had local funding, general funds, we had the 911 surcharge, and so on. Now it is primarily the sales and use tax, which is local general fund. So it's local general fund and the 911 wireless 911 fund. So that since there isn't really a funding source, and there really isn't the code doesn't say that the 911, the wireless 911 funding, the 60% funding, is supposed to fund all of wireless 911. It says 60% of the funding is collected is distributed out to the localities. I guess no one's ever looked at it. Now, I will say that the RAC, Melissa Parsons' group, is looking at what is the current cost of 911 and what are the costs of personnel and that sort of thing. We don't have a baseline for that, so it would we don't have, we've never done the calculation of what the change is because we've never done a baseline before, but we are establishing one now.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? As Dorothy said, as you look at this spreadsheet, if you have things that come up and you have questions about how the formula and the calculation currently works, or what the wireless percentage is today and how it got that way, this is all stuff that was done 5-6 years ago now when the initial calculations were done and the percentages were set. And the current ones are in stone. They will not change. They cannot change. They are what they are. What we're talking about is what will either be implemented July 1st, 17, or if the legislation happens, changed then July 1st, 18, and preparing for that and discussing, how do we do it? And Nikki, your discussion of, well, what does 911 cost and is 911 outpacing the revenue? That's a great discussion to have within that group and to try and understand what it is. I don't know that the board will task this group in January with looking at the surcharge rate and things like that. But I do think it's appropriate to look at, what is the level of funding, what is it supposed to, and having some of those fundamental discussions, because it's really hard to figure out if you've solved a problem, if you can't agree what the problem you're trying to solve is. And just sending money to the locality isn't the problem we're trying to solve. We are trying to do something with this funding, and I think it absolutely is appropriate to figure out, okay, what is it that this is supposed to be doing for the locality, and are they able to do it? When we originally did the personnel funding, the reason the 40,000 minimum came about was, for those of you that weren't here at the time and don't remember, why 40,000 was that the board initially said they wanted to make sure every PSAP could hire one additional person, call taker dispatcher person, a telecommunicator body in every PSAP, because the comp board was funding at a minimum 5, and PSAP managers came and made the argument, we need at least 6 to be able to keep the people we need to handle wireless calls. So the board said, fine, we'll make sure you get 1. And originally it was 30,000. And that was based on the minimum pay of the comp board, which was at the time like 22,000, 21,000 plus benefits. And they just rounded it to 30,000. And then a couple of years later, somebody came in and said, we really need GIS and IT support and to be able to do the mapping updates and things like that we need. So the board said, well, we don't think that's a full position, but the argument was made it's about 10,000. So they added the 10 to the 30 and they got 40 and said, okay, well, we'll make sure that at a minimum, so initially this funding, the 60% funding, or what turned into the 60% funding, was originally supposed to be able to provide 1 call taker dispatcher telecommunicator and ITGIS support in the amount of $10,000. And for those who've been around a while, when we used to do the true up, we needed to show you were spending at least 30,000 local money for the call taker dispatcher type position, and you were spending at least 10,000 on GIS and IT support. And that's how that came about. The reason when we first went to the 60% formula, everybody was getting at least 45,000 just based on the percentages. But when we started doing the recalculations, we started to have that shift to, and we were just doing straight percentage, we started to have that shift to the larger localities. That's just continued during this 5-year lull when we've locked in the rates or the percentages. That shift to the largest localities has just continued in the background based on the data. So now when we use that same methodology we did way back when, it doesn't result in 40,000. In some cases, it results in $13,000 to the locality. And again, we may decide as a Commonwealth that that's what's supposed to happen, that the smallest PSAPs need to think about consolidation and other things. We, ISP, VITA, did not think that was right to do that without having that discussion, and is why we recommended the delay. Any last questions, comments, concerns?
Steve, can we get a copy of the slides?
Absolutely. They're on the website already. Go to our website, vita.virginia.gov/ISP, and go to the webinar series on the bottom left. There's on the list. It's the last one on the list on the left, and the slides are in a PDF there.
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully within a couple days, we'll have the webinar posted. We've been a little behind on posting webinar recordings. We had some technological snafus with it. We hope that we have those resolved now, and actually we're putting them on the Vita YouTube channel. So if you subscribe to Vita's YouTube channel, you'll get alerted when we upload a new webinar series of recording. Any other questions, concerns, comments? And again, the two important meetings coming up, RAC meeting on December 6th, we'll be talking about who should lead this discussion. And again, it's not going to be Vita or ISP. This is talking about how to distribute the local funding among the localities. We will support you, but it doesn't impact us one way or the other with the changes, and we want to make sure that the localities are in control of your own funding. So it's a question of what's the best group to have that discussion and come to some sort of agreement on this funding to the localities. And then the other one is the January board meeting, which is January 12th.
I'm sorry, you broke up, Steve.
The board meeting is January
the 12th.
12th.
That's
12th. And at the January 12th board meeting is where they will discuss and decide what group they will task with the formulation of how to resolve this and move forward. Hoping that the legislation to delay passes, but if it doesn't, increasing the priority of that discussion of what to do about it. Any other questions? If not, thank you all for participating. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Dorothy, myself, or one of your regional coordinator, ISP regional coordinator. And if you forget who that is, check our website. It has a map and has the contact information for the regional coordinators. So thank you all and have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.